spoke about on Shabbos. So those who are there on Shabbos, you'll have to forgive me, but the truth is it's absolutely 100% directly connected to tonight's class. And I might revisit it again and again, but it's, I think, a very powerful story, and a story that has a lot of significance. As I mentioned on Shabbos, but I'll mention it again because it's really directly connected to our class. The story is about a colleague of mine, fellow rabbi, that was invited to be at on a symposium panel to discuss the future of Jewry and how we can keep Jewry relevant and people engaged and connected to Jewry. So you can imagine different rabbis from different parts of the Jewish thinking group. Not all of them are even rabbis. And one of the first speakers on the panel stands up and says, listen, we have to acknowledge that the world is changing and we cannot live in the old world. The times have changed. We've got to adapt ourselves to the new world. So therefore, I believe that we have to, change the Torah, or not focus on the Torah study. The Torah was a book written 3,300 years ago. It's an old ancient book that was relevant in those days, but it's no longer all that relevant. And therefore, it's time for us to start to come up with the times, because we are becoming irrelevant to the future generations. We are becoming irrelevant for our youngsters. Okay. So anyway, as you can imagine, the Chabad rabbi, when he has his opportunity, he says, well, listen, I'm obviously going to respectfully disagree with my colleague over here. As you can imagine, what type of group he came from. And he said, I'd like to just ask the following question to my fellow panelists. Can you please tell me, what are the 60 tractates of the Mishnah? And the guy was like, okay, so sorry, I don't know. He says, tell me, maybe you can tell me what are the books of the Tanakh? He says, well, there's the 5 books of the Torah, and there's the prophets and the writings. He says, tell me the actual books. Sorry, I don't know. Okay, let's keep it simple. What about the 52 portions of the Torah? And the man says, sorry, I could tell you maybe the first few. So the guy says, let's keep it really simple. What are the 5 books of the Torah? He says, Bereshit, Genesis, Exodus. Then he kind of gets stuck. By the way, they're Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy in English. But the guy says, it's just strange. It's a strange phenomenon that we have within the Jewish world, where somebody, by the mere fact that they're Jewish, thinks that they can have a say in Judaism, in the relevance of Judaism, almost, or its logic or its truth. It's like, could you imagine they invited me, a person that doesn't really know science, to be the keynote speaker at a science, at a science panel to discuss science? I would be, it's not appropriate. It's not me. I don't know science. At least I'm not the specialist in science. So what we're going to find out today is that a lot of people really want to find ways to change the Torah, or to adapt the Torah, to amend the Torah. But the truth is that anybody that I believe that truly knows the Torah would have a different perspective. And tonight we're going to focus on that question. Tonight, our question is, should we be adapting the Torah? Number 1. Number 2 is, can we adapt the Torah? And if yes, when not? And why? Why should we or shouldn't we adapt the Torah? Okay, the fact is, going back to our story, that there is nothing that has kept any people in all of history connected to their religion, to their beliefs, to their people, as the Torah has kept us to Judaism. The other fact is that there's no question that the more Torah people learn, the bigger chance they have keeping themselves connected and their children connected to the Torah. So if you want Judaism to be relevant to the next generation, if you want your children to be connected to Judaism, so to speak, or yourself and your own have some type of connection. And I think most Jews do want Judaism to connect. Not the most, but the very, 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 very vast most of Jews. We all want Judaism to be successful. We all want Judaism to be connected to our children. Even people that have, so to speak, left Judaism would like to see Judaism succeed. Just sometimes we struggle. But the fact is that all the statistics show that the more a group or a particular people studies the Torah and is connected to Judaism, the bigger chance they have in staying connected. Now, on that note, we're going to go into our discussion tonight because it's a fundamental discussion. Elements of our discussion we visited in other classes, but we will talk about much of it as a lot of new things tonight. So pay attention. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and we'll use a PowerPoint as well as in previous weeks. No, this is the wrong PowerPoint. Why did I do that? Apologies. Sorry. Okay. Okay, let's see if it works now to share the PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, 1 second, apologies. I have to just make one more change. And no, that is the wrong one. Okay, so as I'm trying to get the right mode for this to work, I want to explain to you where we're going to go with as we're going to go along tonight. The direction that we're going to be taking is that there's certain parts of Torah which are so strong they can't change forever. And there's certain parts of Torah which were made to be temporary. And therefore, you can find the possibility of making those changes. And that's where we're going to go, trying to figure out where we're going. And I think it's quite a fun little line that we're going to take, a fun process that we go. So why I start off with that story is to remind us that when people are looking to make changes in Torah as a goal or as a kind of like a mission, that's a problem. That's not a healthy position from a Jewish perspective. If somebody says like Torah is great, that means that they're understanding the Torah. That means that they study the Torah. So generally, we want people to appreciate the Torah and see that the Torah has what to offer. So the question is there even need to change Jewish law? And do we have the authority to change? Who has that authority to make those changes? So I'm going to start off today.
I just say you have speech to text on. Is that deliberate?
It is, unless you want to turn it off. I could turn it off. Is it annoying you?
I don't know if it annoys me, but I keep trying to read it so I can't listen to what you're saying.
Okay, I'll turn it off. I'll turn it off. It just sometimes it helps with videos later on that it's almost automatically there for people watching the
It's
replay.
okay. If it's better for the video, keep it on and I'll just I'll ignore it.
Okay, let me know.
Yeah.
I could always turn it off. Okay.
Yeah, keep it on, keep it on. Okay.
Okay, I'm sure it's not getting everything exact, but I'm happy to turn it off if you want me to turn it off. Okay,
Well,
so the Rambam starts and tells us one little law. It says like this: it is clear and explicit in the Torah that its commandments remain forever without change, diminishment, or addition. As it states, you shall be careful to perform all these matters that I command you. You may not add or you may not diminish from them. Let's look at that. You may not add and you may not diminish. So this is a verse from the Torah that tells us there will be no additions to the Torah and you're not allowed to subtract from the Torah. What does it tell us? That the Torah is going to be eternal, says Maimonides. And therefore, what God revealed to us is for us and our children forever to carry out all the words of this Torah. This teaches us that we are commanded to fulfill all the Torah's directives forever. Now, this goes on to be, it's an everlasting statute for all generations. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of the 13 principles of faith. Maimonides believes so strongly about this concept that he actually put this as one of his 13 principles of faith. That the Torah is eternal, it cannot change. Now, does that mean that all of Torah cannot change? Now, this is our fifth class in this series of discussions, or even it's actually our sixth class, I think, in this series of discussions. And in our previous classes, we've discussed that the Torah itself divides into different categories. There's the received elements of the yes.
Can I interrupt you? When the word Torah comes up, I've seen the word toilet, I've seen other words, but it's confusing the conversation, what you're saying. So you're probably better off without the writing.
Let me see if I can turn it off. Thanks for that. Is it gone now?
Yes, yes.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. No worries. I appreciate it telling me mistranslating stuff. Yeah, I suppose it doesn't really work when we want to talk about Jewish subjects. But it was a good try. The question is, which category of Torah does it talk about? What does it mean that the Torah is not? Is that everything in Torah? Nothing in Judaism could evolve and change the times. So in the continuation, Maimonides tells us that it's not all of Torah necessarily, but it's particularly the first element of the oral Torah, which is the part that Moses received on Mount Sinai. That's what we call Kabbalah received. The basic interpretation that Moses was told by God on Mount Sinai, that could never change. The ninth, he says this, the ninth fundamental principle concerns nullification, that the Torah of Moses will never be abolished and that God will not give another Torah. There will be no additions to the Torah nor any subtractions from it, neither in its text nor in its received explanations. Okay, so what does it tell us? The text of the Torah could never change. Do you believe that the text that we have today in our books, in our scrolls, is exactly the same text that the Jewish people received 3,300 years ago? That's the question. And we believe that it is. And that could never change. Okay? That's almost impossible to change. As a matter of fact, over the last century, people have rediscovered groups and people from around the world that have, so to speak, been lost, or we haven't heard of them. Sometimes in cases of thousands of years, we found Jews from Africa and from Taiwan and all different parts of the world. And Jews have now somewhat come together. And sometimes we come across old Torahs, and we found that all those Torahs are almost exactly precise. As a matter of fact, even the Dead Sea Scrolls, many people try to say, well, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and those are the oldest scrolls in history to be found, and many of them are pieces of the Torah. And you'll find that some of them are actual Torahs, and those are precisely what we have today. But then some of them have differences, and those ones we know that those are just people's personal notes and handwritings. So Torah has never changed, nor has the explanation to the Torah ever changed. The tradition, the basic interpretation that, for example, that it says that you have to tie for a sign on your arm, and it should be a total between your eyes, that means a black box that has 4 portions of the Torah and black straps that's particularly square, etc., all those laws that can never change because that was received by Moses on Mount Sinai. Okay, now we've spoken about other elements to the Torah. The question is, do they have the ability to change? And let's just first understand, before we get into what's the changing parts of it, let's understand why. Why is this? Why should the Torah, we should see, many people ask, well, the Torah should be able to, so to speak, live with the times, develop and fit with the times. That's the question. Why doesn't the Torah have the ability to develop with the times? And the answer is like this. For those of you that have learned the Tanya, you know that it's a fundamental principle in Judaism, which is highlighted by Hasidic teachings. Tonight, somebody asked me, what is, there's Judaism and what's Hasidism? And the answer is, Hasidism is Judaism. We highlight certain elements, which is mainly the spiritual, deeper elements of connection to God. But that's a big discussion for another time. But within Hasidus, we emphasize this point. The Zohar, here's a quote from the Tanya, and he quotes the Zohar. The Zohar is a primary Kabbalistic work, and Tanya is the primary Hasidic teaching. And says, the Zohar states that the Torah and God are one. This means that the Torah is nothing other than the expression of God's wisdom and will. God compressed his will and wisdom within the 613 commandments of the Torah and their laws. He did this so that each soul, though invested in a human body, should be able to intellectually comprehend his wisdom and will, and to live accordingly in action, speech, and thought. When this occurred, the Torah and its commandments encompass the whole person, and the person is completely and literally bound up with the God in the bundle of life. Let me try to make sense of what I was reading to you. Basically, what it tells us is this. There's the world, and then there's God. God ultimately transcends the world, right? God created the world with the knowledge of what was going to come, with the knowledge of the future, and knowledge of what happens, and what's going to happen, and how the world is going to adapt and change and evolve. And therefore, when God placed the Torah, he created the world, we're going to see that there was God's will was not something that the Torah, the text that we just read tells us that the Torah is ultimately what? It's God's wisdom and will. If the Torah is God's wisdom and will, then are we saying that God can change? That God didn't know the future? When he wrote the Torah, he wrote laws that would apply for all times. That's the incredible thing. All other laws, every other constitution that's ever been written is really only applicable for that particular time in general. Sometimes people try to the best to include future generations, but nobody knows what's going to happen. If we were to say that God couldn't see the future, we're saying that God doesn't know the future. That if we say God's laws don't apply today, then we say that God doesn't know what's going to happen in the future, which is a big question. And that goes against one of Maimonides' other principles. One of the fundamental principles of Judaism is that God is beyond time. He transcends physicality, which is time. And therefore, he's beyond time, and he knows time and physicality cannot affect him. So I'm hoping that this is a bit of a I hope I'm making myself clear. What we're trying to explain is, why can't the Torah change? Because it's God's will, and God's will is eternal. That doesn't change. Is that clear? Tell me if I'm not making sense. Okay. So let's go on a bit. A second element is that what's the problem with change if we try to change the Torah? The problem is that the Torah itself is actually, we say, according to the Torah, we say, when God wanted to create the world, istakil ba'iraisa or bara alma. What does that mean? God looked into the Torah and he says, they said, what do I want? What's the Torah? We just said the Torah is God's wisdom and will. So God looked into what he wanted. What did he want? He wanted people to be living in a physical world and to put on tefillin and to connect to him, to not see spirituality, but nevertheless overcome the physical issues and connect to it. And through that, he created a world so that we would be able to live that type of life. So therefore, the obstructs and changing the world, if we were to change the Torah, we wouldn't be able to connect to God the way he had told us to connect to him, the way he wanted. It's like going and trying to alter your wife's desire and will, and says, no, I know you asked me to buy you flowers, but I know that you really don't want flowers and you wanted chocolate. It's like, that's not what you wanted. About the guy that he wants to buy his wife a friend. So what does he think? He thinks to himself, what do I want? I want to go to the footy. So I'll go and buy my wife as a birthday gift a ticket to the footy. That's basically people that try to change the Torah. They're trying to think, what do they want? And see, does that fit with God? God certainly doesn't want to go to the footy like you. Maybe he goes, I don't know. But he doesn't want what you want. And that's an important point. So therefore, if we try to fit God into our will, we lose touch with the very foundation and the blocks of this world. We lose foundation, the connection that we have to the energy that God put to create the world. And we also lose touch with the channels that God has put for us to connect to him. Any questions on that? No? Is it clear? Does it need to be? Okay. So what we've explained so far is the concept of people wanting to change the Torah, thinking it's not relevant, and we've explained how that's not. It usually comes from a place of ignorance. We've explained that fundamentally the Torah cannot change. Yeah, 1 second, Esther. And then lastly, we've explained why spiritually, why the Torah can't change, because it is ultimately God's wisdom and will, which is eternal, and therefore the Torah must also be eternal. Now we're going to go get more into some of the details. Okay. Yes, Esther, your question, please.
So you are trying to say that, say, if we are on Shabbat, say if we want to come to shul, but we don't live close by and we want to travel, but that's changing, right? So we'll have to drive to come to shul. So what's more important, attending shul or not driving?
Okay, Esther, you're asking me a dangerous question. I'm going to try to phrase your question as it relates to this class. Okay, so the answer to your question is that the Torah doesn't change. The law remains the same, that you shouldn't drive on Shabbos. That's the law. Okay. Does it say that? It doesn't mean that if a person is not religious and was brought up not religious, and the only way they're going to form a connection with Judaism or whatever it is, that's the connection, is through going to shul, they should rather stay home and watch movies instead of going to shul. Or should they come to shul and drive to shul, because in any case they wouldn't be, and that's going to build and enhance their connection to Judaism. So from a halachic perspective, and this doesn't change, the law remains the same. If you were to ask me what's the law would be the same. If you were to ask, we say that this is a question that we do not ask because we don't want to give an answer on it, because the halacha doesn't change. The law is the law and the law is the law. It doesn't change in Torah. Doesn't mean that every single law has to be kept by everybody in the same way all the time. Yes, but sometimes we have to realize that circumstances don't allow for certain people to do certain things or whatever it is, and that's the idea. But we should also know that ultimately there's a concept that we say, the point is that we're not supposed to change the Torah to try to make it easier for people to keep it. Like some people wanted to say, well, there's a bunch of laws of the Torah that are too hard for people, therefore let's change it. We don't want to do that either. So the Torah is true, and we provide services to help people connect, and ultimately how they use that and how they get there is not our business. Okay.
I got it.
Okay, so
Yes.
so I just wanted to, so that's not our business, but ultimately the Torah cannot change, does not change. If it's at least in the biblical character, it's so far we've spoken about the biblical laws will not and cannot change. Okay, so now
Okay.
I want to go on to the next stage of our discussion. That is, we're talking about prophets. What about prophecies, right? What about teachings of the prophets? So that till now we spoke about the 5 books of Moses, and those are basic interpretations. So let's look for a moment at a few texts. It tells us, first of all, in the book of Devarim, Moses tells us, it says, Navi mikirbecha me'achecha kamoni yakim lacha Hashem Elokecha Hashem Elav tishma. God will set up for you a prophet like me from amongst your brethren, and you must listen to him. So we're told we have to listen to prophets. And then Maimonides goes on to explain who is a good prophet. And he tells us that if a person comes up, this is continued, it says that if a person will arise, a Jew or a Gentile, and perform a sign or wonder and say that God sent him to add a mitzvah, withdraw a mitzvah, explain a mitzvah in a manner that differs from the tradition received from Moses, or that the mitzvahs are not forever, but were given for a limited time, this person is a false prophet. For God instructed Moses that this commandment is for us and for our children forever. So if you wanted to know if somebody was true or false, there's difficulties to know if a person is true, but it's very easy to tell if a person is false. What is the first sign of somebody being false, based on what I just read? If somebody changes even iota from the law, if somebody says something doesn't apply anymore, it's not relevant anymore, as soon as somebody says that, you know that they're not a true prophet. Okay, so that's in other words, no one has that ability to just, even if they're going to say prophecies, to say that we should listen. So let's look at this for a minute. We defined a prophet. Later on, he goes on to describe who is a true prophet. And I'll just show it to you on the board, so it's easy. You don't have to listen to the text. He has to be wise and a great personal character, never overcome by an evil inclination or selfish desires. Thoughts must be constantly directed upward and not distracted by vanities. Predict something that comes to pass in all its details a number of times. Now, that's what makes a true prophet. But if he does something else, he can have all these things, as if, or you could think he has all those characteristics. But then he goes and he says we're going to change one element of the Torah. As soon as he does that, we know that the person is no longer true, is no longer a good prophet. Now, this is important. I've spoken about this in the past, and we're going to get into the story that I spoke about in the past. But the point is, there's a great man by the name of Rab Sadia Gaon who lived before the time of Maimonides, towards the end of the, I think it was the end of the 9th century. And he says that not to believe in God or not to believe in the Torah, because some guy does a miracle and says, oh, let's say some guy comes and he does some great miracle for you. He splits the sea, so to speak. He does them, he heals somebody, and then you go, wow, this guy's got powers. And then he stands up and he says, okay, now you don't have to keep kosher anymore. So that's going to be the problem. That will go against the Torah. So people could maybe perform miracles or do miracles. We don't even know if it's real miracles. It could just be some magic trick. But if somebody could do that, and you could suddenly believe them, if that person were to suddenly go and do something or tell you to do something against the Torah, you would know that they're fake. And this, because if you don't do that, we're going to, the whole Torah would be undermined. And I'll explain to you why in a moment. These, so here's what it says. This person must be a false prophet, for no sign can support the impossible. So what does Judaism put in place for us? It puts in place for us major principles. Principle is Torah doesn't change. Now, what happens if somebody does some really great miracle, or it appears to be doing a miracle? Maybe he's just David Copperfield. And now he doesn't say we don't have to do it. So what happened, for example, Christianity or Islam? Christianity, for example, and I'm not sure, we're not here to go against any religions, but we have to explain how they adapted and how we prevented that from happening within Judaism. Christianity, for example, they had people that quote unquote did miracles. Now, whether they were real miracles or they were magic is not really important. That's not the point, because we'll see in a moment, even real miracles cannot cause us to go against a major principle of the Torah. And then this person would come and say, you don't have to keep all the mitzvahs of the Torah. That's how Christianity and Islam and many other religions that try to base themselves of Judaism, they worked. How did they change from Judaism? When the same Torah says you can't change, because they did a miracle, they impressed the people, and then they impressed the people that just because they look good on the outside, they convinced the people that they could change on the inside. In other words, they could change the actual Torah. So let me read to you a text from a man by the name of Reb Chaim Sofer, who's one of the great rabbis of the 17 and 1800s. He was known as the Khatam Sofer. He was an incredible rabbi. He was born in Frankfurt, and he was, till today, he is considered one of the great rabbis of the 17 and 1800s. So he writes the following: the notion that the Torah is not in heaven, and that a prophet may not innovate anything from after Sinai, that concept is the foundation and root of the entire Torah. In other words, the fact that nobody can change it, not even a prophet can change the Torah, is a foundational concept. Okay? If not for this principle, we would be left with no Torah at all. Why? Because I refer to the anecdote recorded in the Talmud in Shabbat, where a heretic argued that since the Jews were exiled from the land, the Torah of Moses was revoked, and a different Torah and signs and miracles by means of deception or sorcery. In fact, the prophet of the Ishmaelites did so, and Shabtai Tzvi was a false messiah, said that the Torah prohibitions became required mitzvot, and required mitzvahs became forbidden. He said we could take away all the mitzvot. Even if we would not believe this, to nullify the entire Torah at once, if we would believe such people, not a single commandment would remain unaltered. Every individual would say, I had a dream that this type of fat is prohibited and that is permitted, and so on, and all the Torah would fade away. Is that clear? So what is he saying? He's saying something powerful, fundamental, and incredible. For those of you that recall the class that we gave as a continuation to the child sacrifice concept of the sacrifice, the binding of Isaac a few months ago, you would probably recall then that we also gave a class on a similar topic, which we're going to talk about in a moment, the great debate of the great oven. But the principle becomes fundamental. Judaism's never changed. Why? Because our principle says that if we allow change, anybody could stand up and make that change. Anybody could change. Anyone could say the times require us to change. I could do miracles that could show you that the change. I could do magic. So how are we going to prevent it? Okay? So that's why we said nobody could change, not even a prophet. So let's remind you of this particular story. As I mentioned, some of you will remember the story very quickly. It's a story about an oven in the Talmud. It says as follows: if an oven is constructed out of layers of clay coils, and sand is placed between each layer. This is an unusual way of how they made ovens in those days. Now, the question is, can it become impure? Is it what we call susceptible to impurity? Is it able to become tamei? That's the question. Rabbi Eliezer said, now there's a concept of clay. Clay sometimes, if it becomes impure, it remains impure forever. But the question is, can it even in the first place? There's certain things that could never become impure, like a broken vessel doesn't have the ability, it has to be a vessel. So the question is, this is a bunch of particles that are stuck together. Can it become impure? So Rabbi Eliezer said it's permanently pure. It could never become impure. The sages argued with him and says, no, it is susceptible to ritual impurity and it can become impure. And the majority of the sages argued with Rabbi Eliezer. Now, to put things in perspective, Rabbi Eliezer was an absolute genius and he knew all of the Torah. Now, the Talmud goes on, and for those of you that recall the class, you'll remember that this was a very enigmatic and powerful story, and one of the most famous stories in all the Talmud. The Talmud goes on to say that Rabbi Eliezer was certain that he was right, but he couldn't convince his colleagues. So on that day, he brought forward every imaginable argument to prove that the oven is not subject to ritual defilement, but the sages did not accept his arguments. They just wouldn't accept it. They thought he was wrong. Okay, so said Rabbi Eliezer, if the halacha agrees with me, let this carob tree grow. There was a carob tree, and he said, let the carob tree start to grow. Thereupon the carob tree was uprooted and moved a distance of 100 cubits, about 50 meters. And some say that it was even as much as 400 cubits. So in front of all the rabbis, a miracle happened, and this carob tree started moving. So no, they replied, no proof can be brought from the carob tree. Again, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let the stream of water outside prove it. Whereupon the stream of water began to flow upwards. No proof can be brought from the stream of water, they rejoined. Again, he urged, if the halacha agrees with me, let the walls of the academy prove it, whereupon the walls of the academy inclined to fall. But Rabbi Yoshua rebuked the walls, saying, scholars are engaged in a halachic dispute. What right have you to interfere? The walls did not cave in completely in deference to Rabbi Yoshua, nor did they resume their upright position in defense of Rabbi Eliezer, and they are still standing thus inclined. Okay. So far, what have we seen? What did Rabbi Yeshua bring as proof for his opinion? He brought miracles. Okay? Were the miracles accepted? No. They said, what does Rabbi Yeshua say? Why are you bringing miracles? Because they say miracle, the principle is the principle. Now this becomes really a powerful point. Again, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let heaven prove it. Thereupon, a voice from heaven proclaimed, why did you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer? The halacha follows his opinion on all matters. Rabbi Yeshua rose to his feet and exclaimed, the Torah is not in heaven. The Talmud continues. What did he mean? Said Rabbi Yirmiyah, from the day the Torah was given at Sinai, we pay no regard to heavenly voices, for you have already written the Torah, follow the majority. Okay, now this is important, a really important element. The question that we have today is, why? Why would God make a voice come down and say that the halacha follows Rabbi Eliezer? Why would he do that? That's my question. So what did we see? We saw like this. You got water flowing upwards. You got trees being uprooted. You see walls caving in, all types of incredible miracles. They were not magic. Rabbi Eliezer was no black magician. He was extremely pious and holy man, and he was certain that he was correct. But the law did not follow him. Why did the law not follow him? Because we learned last week that we follow the majority. We always go based on the majority. So therefore, when he's coming and he's arguing, and he's bringing a proof from a miracle, that doesn't help. You have to convince logically from proofs from the Torah or from laws of derivation to make your case. A miracle doesn't help. So they said, why are you getting involved? But the question is, why did God, so to speak, side with Rabbi Eliezer and allow the voice to do it? Okay. So let me read you one of my favorite readings on the subject. It's really powerful, and I mentioned to you last time I did this class from the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai was one of the great Sephardic, till this day, he's considered one of the great Sephardic rabbis. He was the chief rabbi of Baghdad in 1859, and he wrote a very famous book called the Ben Ish Chai. So that's his name. He was Rav Yosef Chaim of Baghdad. And till today, the Sephardim consider him one of the greatest Sephardic rabbis, all the way back to Maimonides. Anyway, he writes something beautiful. He writes, certainly it was God who caused the miracles and the heavenly voice that suspended the view of Rabbi Eliezer. He did so in order to secure the future of Torah upon a steadfast foundation. Hashem knew that the sages were resolute and truth-seeking. He knew that the miracles and heavenly voice in support of Rabbi Eliezer would not convince the sages to contravene even one commandment of the Torah, including the instruction of to follow the majority. God therefore caused the miracles and the heavenly voice so that the sages disregard of it, and then they would generate an important precedent for future generations. God did it on purpose so that for all future generations, no person would ever be able to nullify even one word of the Torah, because nobody would ever be able to say, oh, even we'll make God's word, we'll make a miracle. And, around this time, there was people like Paul and JC and Jesus, all these different miracles happening, and people saying, look, miracles, we did miracles, therefore let's believe it. Now, that would work for someone that doesn't know the principle, that the principle is the Torah never changes. So, for if even the miracles in the heavens could not persuade the sages to change the Torah law, certainly then nothing would be able to persuade us to do so. God intended that the awesomeness of the story and the publicity it engendered should result in its lesson remaining with the Jewish people for all generations. This has become one of the most famous stories in all the Talmud. And rightfully so, he says. Why? I remember I was the rabbi for a short amount of time of a particular shul. And then one guy comes up to me, oh, I learned that story in the Talmud about the oven. They heard a heavenly voice. What's going on over there? How could they not accept that heavenly voice? Like, what's going on? And then the story goes on that they said that what was going on in heaven, they said, God said, my children have been victorious. My children have been victorious because he said, this is going to prevent future generations from falling into traps of other religions and other fake prophets standing up and saying that they could do miracles and all types of things and change the Torah, right? That's what's going to save the Jewish people. And unfortunately, Rabbi Eliezer, who was a great scholar, he was actually ostracized at that point for using these methods, which are not don't fit with the Torah. According to Torah, if you have a debate with your colleagues, one of the great rabbis, you can't start using miracles. So they had to actually ostracize him. Why? Because he didn't eventually accept the law, which the law is that we follow the majority. Okay, so that's the general principle, and that's why for all generations we can never change the Torah law. I want to pause for a moment and just ask if anybody has any questions before I go on to some exceptions to this rule. Anybody wants to ask, disagree, anything? No? Okay. All right. I'm hoping it's all clear. If somebody needs me to re-explain something, I'm happy to do so. Now, I want to talk about a few exceptions that could apply to this rule and how that works. So far what we've said is that Judaism can and will never change in the fundamentals, in the basic understanding of the Torah. The basic law and how we understand the Torah will never change. That can never change. That stays forever. I get all different types of, with the world evolving and sexuality questions and gender questions and all these questions, which is the world that we live in today. And with the technology advancing and medicine advancing, these questions become really important, because people say, well, the Torah is not the same Torah as it was. But when we have those periods and we could see, wow, even the heavenly voice can change the Torah, we understand that certainly somebody's mood changes or his other issues are not going to make us change the Torah. And therefore we could be certain that for many, 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 many thousands or hundreds of years to come, no matter what come what may, Judaism will still be there, because nothing will be able to change us. And it will be the most relevant way to continue Judaism. However, there are certain things that do allow us, that have changed historically. But what are they? So if you look historical, if there was, for example, if you had a particularly great scholar or prophet, sometimes they were able to make a temporary change to a law if it was for an extreme circumstances. So I said before that a prophet is never allowed, or one of the proofs is that they could never, ever change. And if they make one change, and you know that they're false, but there were times, for example, Elijah the prophet, the law was that you're not allowed to bring a sacrifice out of the temple. And he did that once. And he said, because at that time, almost all the Jewish people on the Israel side of Israel were not allowed to visit. There was a civil disagreement between the one side of Israel and the other side of Israel, and those people weren't able to visit the temple, and they were all starting to follow the idolatry of Baal. So therefore he said, if I don't do this and bring that sacrifice on this one exception time, we will lose all those Jews. And therefore a miracle happened, a beautiful story for another time. But there was one exception. But how did he do it? Because he said it was going to save all the Jews, and it was only going to be temporary. The second time that we know that the prophet said it is Elisha, who was the successor of Elijah. The next prophet, he said that Jews can chop down trees during the wartime, which is something that generally is not allowed. There was a time when the temple was inaugurated. King Solomon said that for that year, they didn't have to fast on Yom Kippur. And there's a famous story, this is a really interesting one as well, of the Shimon, the high priest, who was one of the high priests in the Second Temple era, towards the beginning of the Second Temple era. He's known as Shimon HaTzadik. And when Alexander the Great came conquering the Middle East and that part of the world, he left the temple and went and greeted Alexander, wearing all the clothes of the high priest. That is something that goes against the Torah. The high priest is only allowed to wear those clothes inside the temple. So how did he do it? And the answer was, what happened was, when he went out to greet Alexander, Alexander got off his horse and actually bowed to him. And his soldiers were shocked and never seen Alexander the Great bow down to anybody. And he said, I've seen the image of this man before me in my battles. So that we're told that he did that to actually save the Jewish people. And as a result, Alexander the Great allowed Jewish people to keep their traditions and not having to follow and become Hellenized. So that's an example of when it could be changed. But when could it be changed? Only because it's a temporary change, not a permanent change. Now, here's another example of when a law has changed. I'll give you an example. Did you know that what happens if Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbat? Well, the Torah says that on Rosh Hashanah we have to blow the shofar. What happens if Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbat? Do we blow the shofar? And the answer is no. How could that be? So the Torah says to blow the shofar. The rabbi said that what they saw is that when Jews when they allowed the blowing of the shofar on Shabbat, then Jews were carrying it, which is going against another biblical law, and they were transgressing a negative commandment. So in order to prevent a negative command from being transgressed, and the same thing happened with lulav and etrog on Shabbat. They said we shouldn't do it because people were carrying it and therefore transgressing a negative commandment. They said they could sometimes stop a positive commandment, only a positive, saying don't do the positive commandment. But they can never ever tell people to long-term transgress a negative commandment, and don't. don't do this, don't that's something they can never do. And now, according to Kabbalah and Chassidut, they never changed it. That they said that we believe, for example, that the Shabbat, it's not because only the technical reason they're carrying it on Shabbat, but we believe that the Shabbat itself is able to achieve what the shofar itself can achieve, right? And that's why it actually fulfills the same thing. Okay. Here's another a time when there was a space for a law to be changed within Judaism. It says like this: we spoke about the received basic interpretation of the Torah, the biblical Torah, that can never be changed. But what happens if the rabbis had a debate in how to derive a particular law from the Torah? And there was different opinions. Remember a few weeks ago, we spoke about the debate between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Petura about if you had only a small amount of water and you had a choice who to save, do you save yourself and only drink the water yourself, or do you share the water? And we mentioned that the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, that you drink the water yourself, you don't have to share it. Now that was the majority at that time. What happens if later on rabbis revisited that? Would they be able to revoke that law? And the answer is that if it was the original Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin was the temple, the great body of Jewish law. What do you call it? The great parliament, the great rabbinate that of 70 judges that sat in the temple. They were able to make changes, and they could only to the way it was derived. In other words, they could only say, well, it was derived one way by Rabbi Akiva, another way by Ben Petura. We're going to say that now we think that actually the majority should follow, majority follows Ben Petura. So the Talmud says that the same concept applies to the Talmud. We hold, or Maimonides, later generations accepted that the Talmud itself also has the ability to change certain laws the way they were derived, because sometimes, how did it work? You needed the majority, and when something was voted on, so to speak, in the Talmud, that meant that the majority of scholars at the time accepted it, and that remained something for all time. Okay, so in answer to the question of when can the Torah change, if it was derived in one particular way, and you had another Sanhedrin, another of the leading court, argue with that previous one, and the majority changed and followed a previous opinion, then it could change. Okay. Now, what about the other parts of the Torah, like the legislative parts of the Torah? Can that change? There's a condition. Yes. So let's say one of the 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, the great court of the Jewish people made a particular law, right? They said that, for example, you're not allowed to marry two women, right? So could they change that law? And the answer is, now, first of all, that's an exception to the rule, because that law was originally made only to be temporary, and it was only renewed later on to be for a long term, and now it is an eternal law, but originally it was meant to be temporary. But if you were to find such a law, if that group had to be greater in number and in wisdom than the previous courthouse that made the law, they would be able to make the changes. But why do they have to be greater in wisdom? I'll tell you why. Because they may say that now the times have changed, and therefore we think that no longer should people be required to, for example, hear the Megillah and Purim. We don't think that you need to do it anymore. But they might think that the problem is that they don't realize that the basic reasoning may have changed, but the actual deeper spiritual reason they probably are not aware of. In other words, to every concept in Torah, there's the basic law, and then there's the spiritual law behind it. The spiritual law, you have to be like a Kabbalist, like really, knowledgeable in Kabbalah in order to understand that stuff. So therefore, if the courthouse is not going to be as great, they may say, well, this particular element, that the reason why they originally made that law doesn't apply anymore. For example, there's a concept known as Chalav Yisrael, which is milk that comes from Jewish people watched being milked. So some people said, well, it doesn't apply anymore. But we know that there's a Kabbalistic concept to it. So just because elements of it don't apply anymore, it doesn't mean the whole concept doesn't apply. The spiritual elements may still apply. Because mitzvot are not just physical laws, they're also spiritual laws. And just because the physical elements don't apply, the spiritual, and that's why we can't just change them. I'm going to end it over here. We have a bit more to discuss, but there has been changes, other changes that have been made. For example, the Jewish calendar in the old, according to the Torah, Jewish calendar has to be set by the calendar the way it was done. It has to be done by people witnessing the moon appearing. They would see the moon appearing in the sky. They'd have to witness that, and then they would then they would be able to decide what the date of the calendar is. By today's day and age, when things changed in diaspora and we no longer had the Great Court, they established that for all time, they established that for all time from now on, we should have a set calendar, and everyone follows, and we don't wait any longer for people to witness the viewing of the moon. Why? Because we no longer have a temple for people to go up and do that whole dedication, so it doesn't apply anymore. Okay, so there's a lot more to discuss on the subject on exceptions, but I hope this has been at least eye-opening for you, that you've seen how Judaism adapts. Judaism in general can adapt, but the principles, God's opinion, was adaptable to start off with. It was everlasting always, and therefore it's never going to change. God's will and wisdom is for all time, no matter whether we are in 2022 or we in 02. The law will still be, God's will still be the same. And therefore, ultimately, the way we connect to God and the way we connect to our Judaism and the way we continue it, without a doubt, is by being as true as possible to the way it was given originally on Mount Sinai, and finding our ways to make it relevant to our lives to the best of our abilities. Okay, so that's the summary of how Jewish law works and how it can possibly at times be changed. I hope that's clear. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, thank you for joining and have a good night. But please ask any questions if you have.
Yes. Is it true that once Bet HaMikdash is built again or rebuilt, the way we understand it from laws, we interpret it from laws, is going to change from being lenient, like Bet Hillel, which we go according to, and it's going to go to Bet Shammai, which is more stringent. So we're going to interpret things in a different way.
So yeah, the answer is to that is that when Mashiach comes, we will have all the great rabbis of history, and then they will say that the times now are changed, and because that's a great example, because when at that time majority will want to take the stringent approach, because we will be more in tune with that stringent approach. It will be more acceptable for the Jewish people. So therefore, we will want to do the stringent approach, and therefore, they will rule that we should. Okay, but today, when they acknowledge the shortfalls and the difficulties of what it is like to be, it's difficult to be a human being in a human body, trying to do spiritual things. So therefore, they were lenient, or they chose generally the more lenient opinion, and that was the majority. But yes, if the majority will change, and our understanding is will change, because our ability to stay tuned to what that spirituality will change as well. But that's a great point, and that's an example of where something changes, but the actual core principle doesn't change, even when Mashiach comes, but only the way it's derived. In other words, we'll follow the minority of today, but the majority of the future. Okay, so the Torah is still not changing. Just which one we're deriving from, we'll derive it from the stringent instead of the more lenient.
Well, one of the mitzvot just says you could sum it all up with saying one of the mitzvot says you're not allowed to change anything. So that's all there is to it, really.
One of the mitzvot says you're not allowed to change anything, right? And therefore what?
So therefore, the whole so that kind of rules out any changes to the Torah or the way we do mitzvot. or
Yeah, you're
what's allowed
100%
and what's
correct.
not,
That's all it is. You're 100%. It all boils down to that. But the fact is that throughout the generations, people have tried to change that part of the Torah. And this takes us back to the beginning of the series where we spoke about how you have people saying that when the Torah says you shouldn't make a fire on Shabbos, that means you can't even have the fire before Shabbos, like the Sadducees that didn't want to believe in the oral Torah. That fundamentally goes against the way it was given by Moses on Mount Sinai, because they don't believe in that, right? So that element also can't change, and people have to understand that law applies to all the interpretations that were given to Moses as well. And not only that, it even applies to a heavenly voice and to miracles. And when people realize that, because people say, well, yeah, the Torah could never change, but if I had a miracle, then I would change. As if a prophet, that seems logical, right? But if you tell no, the principle that it never changed, it even applies when there's miracles. In other words, the principle itself doesn't have exceptions to it. The principle remains true to the principle. It doesn't say unless somebody performs a miracle, which is, by the way, the mistake that most people have fallen throughout history, besides for those that were aware of this and stayed true to the Judaism. And that's why, as I mentioned, that fellow that says, how can the rabbis not agree with the heavenly voice? That's how we prevent that, because even that is not the exception.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you. Laila Tov. Laila Tov. If anybody has any
Thank
other
you,
questions,
Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Yochanan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you,
Thank you, Rabbi.
All the best.
All the best. Have a good night.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov. Good night, Maria. Good night, Yochanan.